Welcome to another episode of Whitetail Rendezvous, coming to you 6 days a week as we interview whitetail experts and hear their traditions and personal stories of the hunt. Learn more about the latest gear, discover proven tips, and the latest strategies so you can make your next hunt a success. Now here's your host, Bruce Hutchin.
This is part two with Josh Honeycutt, deer hunting editor for Realtree.com. And Josh just finished up on August prep, and now we're going to be talking about early season. Josh, again, welcome to the show, and let's just jump right into it. Early season's been very good to you, and so let's share with the people why and some tips, techniques they need to think about for early season hunting.
Yeah. I don't do anything but hunt, really, during the early season, and that's as most do. No secret powder. You can go out there and dump on the ground and get deer to come in and make everything okay. And if you're not seeing them, obviously, I'm not saying anything bad about baiting. I'm just making a joke. There's no secret formula once you get into the season. The secret formula is all the work that you've done prior to the opener. So all the stuff that you did during the postseason, everything you did during the summer, basically you've done the work already. Now all you got to do is pull the trigger. So when come opening day, I will do one more camera check on all of my cameras just prior to the opener. I don't like to do it the day before the opener, but about a week or so, maybe 4 or 5 days before the opener, I will do that one more time. And I will continue glassing from afar all the way up to the afternoon before the hunt, as long as I can get in there and do that without bumping deer. But, and that's all in an effort just to finalize what deer I'm going to end up hunting. If I have multiple target deer that I'm kind of considering, I will choose between the top 2 or 3 that I've got on my quote-unquote hit list and see which one is the most mature, which one's the biggest, which one's the most huntable, daylight active, which one has the best pattern to go on. And I'll kind of mash all those things up into a unofficial formula in my head and decide what to do on opening day. So opening days there, I'm not as big on hunting mornings during the early season. I'm not saying that you shouldn't. There's definitely situations where you can and where you should. But more times than not, I don't hunt of a morning. It all depends on how your property's laid out, how your entry and exit routes are, where your bedding areas are in correlation to your food destinations. So there might be situations, geography and terrain depending, where you can actually get in there and hunt deer of a morning without spook. So if you can do that and you think you have a legitimate shot at killing a deer of a morning during the early season, go for it. But most of my properties, there are very few instances that I've seen throughout the years where I could get in there and do that. So I don't do it very often, but it's mostly because my properties that I hunt don't lay out very well for me to do so.
When people ask me, they said, should I hunt in the morning or should I hunt in the evening? I say evening, because the deer they've seen, probably they've seen coming in the feed or coming out of the woods or coming to water. The water or food, because one, it's hot, so they're going to water. So when I think about that, what's your recommendation no matter where they are in the country?
In my mind, unless it's just a dynamite spot that you can get into without bumping deer of a morning, you've been spending all this time and effort glassing from afar, checking trail cameras, monitoring trail cameras. You've focused solely all summer long throughout the preseason, trying to home in on afternoon patterns. So you're not out there glassing from afar, generally not at daybreak. So everything you're doing throughout the summer, in your mind anyway, at least in my mind, is focused on, okay, that afternoon pattern, that afternoon bed to feed pattern. That's what I'm focused on. That's what all my preparation has been around. And so why go in there during the opening morning and potentially screw up all of that preseason work? So you've been focused on those afternoon patterns. Again, if you think you have a situation where you can go in and kill that deer opening morning, definitely do so. I'm not discouraging that at all. But more times than not, you're going to do more harm than good.
One thing people have asked and said, hey, Bruce, where did deer go? The summer pattern's over, and then they kind of just become ghosts. What's up with that?
Yeah, there's a lot of things that factor in there. At least here at home, I see the deer using their same summer patterns until about the middle of September, around September 15th or so. Some of them go longer. Some of them go shorter. Some deer change over to their fall patterns the first week of September. Some don't do it until the last week of September. It's different for every deer. But there are several several factors in play. Primarily, obviously you've got those bachelor groups that's going to break up. And whenever they break up, traditionally, that's when they start shifting to their fall ranges. And I've seen about 50% of bucks, give or take, plus or minus, are going to have a different fall range than summer range. And that's at least what I see here where I hunt. So that's obviously what's happening. But why is it happening? So again, about 50% of those bucks, if you have a deer on your camera and he up in bandages, well, there's a 50% chance, more or less, that his fall range simply isn't where his summer range is. Other things are in play too. Obviously, at that point, you've had some hunting pressure. That's a week to 2 weeks into the season, if not more. So if it's the end of September, deer might start reacting to that hunting pressure. But I think the biggest factor is changing food sources. There's a huge, huge shift throughout much of the country from mid to late September when it comes to food sources. They've been eating green soybeans and green food sources all summer long. I'm not saying that. Let's not even restrict this to ag country. Let's put it over on the hill country of eastern Kentucky and eastern Ohio, or wherever you might be, where there's no ag or very little. Deer have been eating green food sources all summer long. That's what they've been keying on. They've been eating soft mast, depending on what type of soft mast. Some soft mast doesn't start dropping until late September, early October. So that's not really true in every instance. If you get down into the South, there's some more soft mast that they key on late summer, early fall. But anyway, the biggest transition is they're transitioning from those green food sources to hard mast. That's when your acorns start dropping. You got your white oaks, your red oaks, your pin oaks, all the huge long list of oak trees that start dumping acorns around the middle to end of September. That changes things. And that can even take place as late as early to mid-October too, depending on when your trees start dropping. And it's different every year and it's different for every place. So that's kind of a blanket statement, a broad statement. But whenever the acorns start dropping, when the hard mass starts dropping, that's going to change what deer do. And it's going to make it seem as if they're not moving during daylight. Most times they still are, though. They're just moving during daylight in different areas. Now, granted, if the oak trees are fairly close to their bedding areas, all they do is stand up and start eating. So they're still moving in daylight, just like they did whenever they were traveling 100 or 200 yards to get to a soybean field during the summer. But now that food source is much, much closer in general to their bedding areas than it was during the summer. So it's not that deer just don't want to move in daylight now. It's just they don't have to because the food's much closer to the bed.
What I read and heard and talked with folks, let's go back to the oaks. Some like white oaks, and then you get the red oaks, and there's a whole variety of oak trees. And so the only thing I can say is know what's on your ground and have journals about what specific tree drops at what date typically. We're getting really anal about this, but deer know what tree is going to drop the best protein for them and when they do it. Just like I've seen elk circle a mountain on the elevation where the mushrooms are coming up. Shroom and bulls. Yes. I've seen it in New Mexico. I mean, I'll never forget it. We just sat on the top and they would just circle the mountain eating mushrooms. And so if you know that, then you can get ahead of them because you can't call them off the food. They're not going to do it, but you can intercept them. And from what I understand, whitetails are the same way. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think so. When it comes to those oak trees, well, obviously, at least around here, deer prefer white oaks over any of the others. It has to do with the level of bitterness and acidity within that acorn. The tannin levels are much, much better in a white oak than they are, say, a red oak. And that's why you have a white oak here and a red oak here. And basically, if they drop on the same day, all your deer are going to be under that white oak tree. So it's something to consider. Absolutely. Having a journal, like you said, that's a great point in my mind. Having the historical dates of when they drop, listing what type of oak it is, whether it's a white oak or a red oak or a pin oak or a black oak or a water oak, whatever type of oak it is. Yeah, that's crucial and very, very important, especially if you're in an area that has a lot of oak trees. Absolutely.
Some people watch deer all season long, and then they get mystified when they switch over. And I like what you said about the deer doesn't have to go 50 yards from where she's bedding to get food.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially if they're bedding in timber. Now, if they're bedding in some really early successional habitat, if they're bedding in some CRP, if they're bedding in just a thicket that's got a bunch of briars and brambles, and if they're bedding in locations that's not already got some big timber in it, that's obviously not the case. So they still got to get up and travel. But if you're hunting properties that has a lot of big mature timber on it, or maybe there's some thick growth that's really, really close, it's right on the fringe of some big mature timber that has some good oaks that are dropping, that's the case. They just don't have to go very far. Say you've got early successional habitat right here. It's thick, it's gnarly, it's growed up, there's beds all in it. And then you've got a row of mature hardwoods right here. And then you've got edge of your field right here and big soybeans down here. Well, all summer long, they've been up here. Well, they may not have been bedding all the way up here in this thick growth. They may have been bedding right there on the edge of that food. But say, for the sake of the story here, let's say they've been bedding up here in that thick stuff all along. Well, all summer long, they're traveling through those hardwoods. Those hardwoods aren't dropping yet. They're getting all the way down here to this soybean field. And you got a tree stand down here or a camera or something right on the edge of that soybean field. And all summer long, you're seeing deer there like clockwork, daylight activity. Well, then things change. That soybean field starts turning. It's got a lot of yellow leaves in it, or it's all yellow leaves, or maybe the leaves have fallen off already. Acorns have started dropping. So all of a sudden, you don't get any pictures down on that soybean field until maybe 10 o'clock at night or 12 o'clock at night when those deer start getting out and start meandering around. It's not that they don't want to move during daylight. It's not that they've become nocturnal. It's just the simplest food and bed correlation and the relation of the two locations. They're just not getting to that field anymore. They're going from that thick habitat where they're bedding at during the day, right there next to them, just to the south. They've got all those oak trees, and they may sit there and feed on acorns for 2 or 3 hours before they get out and start going elsewhere. So it's just something to keep in mind, especially when you're looking at these changing times throughout the season. And again, that's not something that should really affect anybody. There's been very, very few seasons where I've seen that transition happen around the opener. Really can only recall 1 year where that really happened. So that's not something that you really have to worry about until we get toward at the earliest, really the middle of September. But generally it's happening around the end of September, beginning of October is when that really starts to take effect.
One thing I'd like to touch on is cold fronts, because summertime, we typically don't have huge differences, deltas varying in temperature. Yeah, a storm blows through and it might drop 5 degrees, 10 degrees, or maybe more. But it seems like in the fall, when we have a cold front come through, it changes the deer habitat, activity a lot more. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, cold fronts are huge. It doesn't matter what time of year you're in, what part of the season it is. In my mind, they're big year-round, season long. But I feel like those first couple cold fronts of the season, really the first cold front of the season, is going to be your biggest and most prominent, most effective cold front to hunt during the month of September. And that applies to the people who hunt in states that don't open up until October as well. It doesn't matter when your opener is. The first, especially if you hunt in September, where you're getting a ton of constant, consistent hot weather. And then you get that first good break. You get that first good 20-degree drop, and you get that perfect cold front that everybody dreams about. If that happens during September, I think it's a little more effective than those who have to wait until October to hunt. That said, it's always good, but I think you're 100% right. I think that first cold front is probably the best bet as far as hunting cold fronts during the season.
Okay. $1 million question. Why? Why does it increase behavior?
And it's not necessarily a difference in the deer's behavior. In my mind, it is more or less has to do with hunting pressure. And I'm coming at this from a point where every property I hunt, I'm sharing permission. I don't have sole control over any property that I hunt. So obviously cold fronts have been talked about and written about for years and decades even. People are in tune with cold fronts now. So hunters keep an eye on those. The reason I say the first one is the key one is because you're probably not going to have as much hunting pressure when that first cold front hits as you will that second and third one. Now, there might be just as many hunters in the woods on that first one as that second or third one, but the deer haven't had time to react to that pressure yet.
So you're correlating cold front comes through, even though everybody's taking their call-in, they're sick, on any given piece of wood, they're just not in tune to the pressure yet? Is that basically what you're saying?
Yeah. I don't think that a cold front in September has any different effect on a deer than a cold front in October or November. But it just goes back to any tactic or any factor that you want to throw out there and talk about. earlier the better when it comes to the hunting pressure. I think deer become wiser and wiser throughout the season. And so I think you're going to see a little bit more daylight activity. I think you're going to see deer move further from their beds on that first cold front of the season, especially if it falls within the first few days of the opener. I think you're going to see much more of a reaction and much more daylight activity on that first cold front of the season than you will maybe later on. Like I said, it all goes back to hunt pressure. Now, you can relate that to any tactic. You can relate that to rain events or any factor that gets deer on their feet. Things get progressively worse and worse throughout the season if you're hunting places that get pressured. Now, if you're hunting a really manicured property that doesn't get pressured, you're not going to see a huge difference if you hunt it right. If you're personally hunting a property right and you're not spooking deer, you have good entry exit routes, I don't think you're going to see much difference in those. But if you're hunting public land that gets pressured, or if you're hunting private land that gets pressured, I think you see the effectiveness of cold fronts and other things that get deer on their feet. I think you'd see a decreasing or degrading effectiveness of those things as the season goes on. So that's why I say the first one is the best one if you're hunting pressured places.
Josh, do I hunt 24 hours before the cold front hits, right before the cold front hits? I mean, literally hours during the cold front or right after the cold front goes through?
I personally don't have a preference, not really. I know everybody's different. Everybody has a different opinion on that topic. I guess more or less, if I'm just like everybody else, I'm an average Joe deer hunter. I can't hunt every day of the week. I have to pick and choose my battles there. So I would say that if you can get out there right before the cold front moves through or during it or right after, whatever your schedule allows, I think is going to be good. Anytime around that cold front, better than it was the few days leading. The key thing is change. And it doesn't have to be a cold front either. It can be a warm front. A sharp increase in temperature, I think, oftentimes get deer on their feet too. I don't think it has quite the effect that a cold front does. But I think just a sudden change in the deer's environment, whether it's an increase in temperature or a decrease in temperature, if it's been sunny all week long and then boom, you get overcast skies or you get some light rain that comes in, just change. I think change. I don't think deer like change. I think it gets them on their feet. So I like hunting the back sides of those cold front probably, but I also like hunting the front sides of those cold fronts too. And the reason I say that is because a lot of the time the front sides of those cold fronts have some kind of weather with them, whether it be some rain that comes through. And I like to hunt in the rain. Deer move during the rain. Matter of fact, the deer that I killed last year was during the rain. So if you can hunt the front side, great. If you can hunt the back side, great. If you can hunt as it's dropping, that's great too. I think you're going to see an increase in likelihood of success regardless of which of the three you go with. But I guess my answer to that would be all three if you can.
When we think about early season, you're in Kentucky. So when does your season open up?
I think this year is September 7th. It's always the first full weekend in September.
So now they're probably still in velvet. Is that correct?
Oh, yeah.
When do they start rubbing off and their antlers are hardening? When does that usually occur?
It's a little bit different every year. I mean, there's a window there, but I've seen them, and it depends on the deer too. Depends on the individual deer, but it can be as early as the first few days of September. It could be as late as September 15th, September 20th. That's just how it is here. Now, I know it's different everywhere you go in the country, but that's how it is here. Prime example would be I killed my deer last year on September 5th. By the time I actually recovered the deer, it was a little bit right around midnight. So I may have been September 6th by the time I recovered the deer because I gave him several hours. But that deer that I killed, he was in velvet. But the big nine, the big mature 4.5-year-old 9-point that he was running with, or one of the deer that he was running with, that deer was already clean out of velvet whenever I shot my deer on the 5th. And the reason I know that is because I saw them both come out at the same time. So shot my deer the afternoon of the September 5th. He was still in velvet, had one little peel coming off of his G2. So my deer, I'd say, if I hadn't shot my buck when I did, he would have probably come out of velvet within 24 hours, at most 48 hours. But the big 9 that he was running with was already clean out on the 5th.
When you think about breakup of bachelor groups, because if you're long-distance scouting during the summer, you might see a number of bucks running together and hanging together. All of a sudden, they shed the velvet and the bones harden. Do you see a typical dispersal of the bachelor groups?
Yeah, I don't think that the velvet coming out is the trigger. I mean, it's one of the triggers. I think whenever they see the velvet comes off and they've rubbed that velvet and they start sparring and they start tinking the antlers together, I think it is the trigger. But based on my experience, they don't break up as soon as that velvet comes off. I think the primary decider of when those bachelor group breaks happen is testosterone levels. Obviously, rising testosterone, that's what triggers the velvet to shed and to come off. But I don't think that the testosterone has risen to the point yet whenever the velvet comes off for those bucks to really get mad at each other and disperse. I think what happens is, and again, I'm not a biologist, this is just my opinion. I think, as the summer progresses, you've got pretty low testosterone levels. When you look at the grand scheme of things, pretty low testosterone levels, especially compared to the fall. But then, you get to the end of the summer, and then you get to sometime in early September, and the testosterone has risen high enough that it causes the velvet to shed. The deer start sparring a little bit. Maybe a few days go by, maybe a couple weeks go by. But then the testosterone gets to that point where, okay, they start getting mad at each other. They don't want to be bedding close to one another. And I think that's what causes the bachelor groups to break up.
One thing that I've seen and other people have seen, Josh, is that early in September, you'll see football, what I call football scrape, about the size of a football. And I've come to understand that they're made by young bucks that all of a sudden the testosterone is increasing and they want to start the process. Your thoughts on that?
I don't know if I could answer that question. You're saying I see those smaller scrapes during the early season, found scrapes during the spring and the summer. Deer will scrape year round. The intensity and the frequency is much, much higher in the fall, but I have seen deer tend to scrape in June. They will scrape year round, but I just don't think that it really gets in their head to do it as often as they do it during the rut until it gets that time. Personally, I think sometimes, depending on what's located, you got different types of scrapes. If a scrape doesn't have a licking branch over it, I think it's a scrape that a buck made out of frustration. Maybe it's a display of dominance. If it has a licking branch over it, though, it's probably a scrape that's going to get hit more than once. If it's a pretty small scrape, there may be only one buck that's tending to that scrape. If you see a massive scrape, it's probably what a lot of people refer to as a community scrape that multiple deer are using. But I guess that would be my long-winded, roundabout, halfway answer to that question or that prompt.
So let's talk about your 3 specific tactics for early season hunting.
Yeah, I don't know that there's any specific tactic that I deploy. I mean, I don't rattle during the early season. It's all about whitetail behavior and basically, I guess, more or less trying to get in that deer's way. More times than not now, I'm hunting a specific deer because I spend so much time scouting and glassing and running cameras. Don't get me wrong, I am targeting a buck. Now, there might be a couple bucks on the farm that I'd shoot, but I'm game planning around one specific deer. And then if I see another good target buck that's either on my radar or not, I'll take the opportunity to shoot that deer. I won't pass up on a good buck just because I'm hunting a different buck. Yeah, I guess I'm just trying to get in that deer's way. I'm just trying to figure out what his pattern is, where he's bedding, where he's feeding, and I'm trying to get between the two. I'm trying to get as close to that bed as I can without spooking him. If I'm hunting a deer that's willing to travel 200 or 300 yards during daylight, then yeah, sure, I'll get back off the bed closer to the feed. And that's part of what I'm trying to figure out during the summer and the preseason. But if I'm focused on a deer that I know doesn't move very far from his bed during daylight, and that's the case whether it's early season, rut, or late season. But if I know he's a deer that does not like to move far from the bed during daylight, I'm obviously creeping in, getting closer to that bed. The closest I like to get to a particular buck bed that is probably about 90 to 100 yards. I don't like to get much closer than that. You can definitely get closer if the conditions are right, if you have the good wind, if you have some winds at least, 9-10 mile an hour, you got some wind cover there that covers your noise. There's different circumstances and different situations, so that's not always that's a fluid answer. It's not always a constant. But I guess more or less, I'm just trying to figure out what that deer's doing and put myself in that deer's way.
With that, folks, we're going to wrap up early season tactics and strategies with Josh Honeycutt from Realtree.com. Josh, thanks for being on the show, and we're going to take a break now and do part 3. Listen to this because Josh is going to tell us about his favorite time to hunt during the rut.
Thanks for joining us. Be sure to tune in tomorrow for another episode of Whitetail Rendezvous, where you can listen and learn from the experts so you can be more successful on your next hunt. Until next time, listen, learn, and succeed.